From 1974's Goodnight Vienna album, Ringo Starr with Snookeroo, a song written by Elton John and Bernie Taupin, and that was going out to Rockin' Bob in Fairlawn, who requested that track. Ringo Starr is the subject of a recent biography called Ringo with a Little Help by our guest today, Michael Seth Starr. No relation. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
You know, there have been so many books written about the Beatles over the years, in fact, decades. Why focus solely on Ringo?
Well, I think we read so much about the group and about the group's history and their effect on pop culture, and I can go on and on, the 60s and all that. But nobody had ever really taken the time to write a nuts and bolts, warts and all look at one of the key members, and that's Ringo Starr. So I took it upon myself to do that. I hope I did a fair job. There had been one or maybe two other books about Ringo, but that only took us up to his life in the early 1990s, which was the last one, and it was published mostly only in England. And I'm always looking for interesting people to write about, and I'm a Beatles fan, and I said to myself, you know what? Why not Ringo? He is the most famous drummer in the world. You say Ringo, everybody knows who he is.
Exactly.
Don't have to explain him. And he has had a very interesting life, and the book came out in conjunction with his 75th birthday. And a bonus for me that he was voted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo act. I didn't know that when I started writing the book. It had not been announced yet, but that was good timing. And listen, I mean, circumstance has dictated that it's now only Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney left from the Beatles, unfortunately. And he is a trailblazer and sort of the granddaddy of all rock and roll drummers as we head into mid 2016 now.
And I'm so glad that Ringo got into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo act, because the Beatles had been inducted years before. John was in as a solo, Paul as a solo, George as a solo, and it was almost like the rock and roll establishment had been saying for years, well, Ringo, he's no big deal.
You know, let's face it, Ghosty, he took a lot of criticism over the years for not only for his playing, but for just the fact that he was the last one to join the group, and people said he was lucky, and he got lucky, and the timing was everything. And yes, to a certain extent, timing is everything in life, and he was lucky to join the group at that time. But I think people who don't know the fact that he was recruited into the Beatles because he was known as the best drummer in Liverpool at that point in time. In 1962, after they had fired Pete Best, Ringo was their top choice.
You know, it's interesting. I've always been surprised that there are some Beatles fans out there who say they have the highest regard for Lennon and McCartney, and then just totally dismiss Ringo as if he just lucked into a situation there. I mean, that's almost like saying John and Paul were idiots. You know, obviously they knew what they were doing when they brought Ringo in. In fact,
right.
Ringo's drumming on the song Rain is so distinctive and influential. There are rock and roll drummers who've based their entire careers on what Ringo did in that one song. That was the B-side to Paperback Writer, Rain by the Beatles, here on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop. Our guest today is Michael Seth Starr, his book, Ringo with a Little Help. Now, this is not an authorized biography. In other words, you didn't sit for 7 hours and interview Ringo for this book. He declined to participate, but in a strange turn of events, he announced on his Facebook page that he was not a part of the book, and in a way gave you a lot of free advertising.
Yeah, it was, yeah. And you know, it's funny, I agree with you, and it sort of gave me a little more impetus at the time than I was looking for, or a little more publicity than I really was looking for at the time. As you do, or as I would imagine most biographers do, if they're going to write about a subject who's still alive, you approach them and you ask, would they be interested in interviewing, sitting for an interview, and I did that. With Ringo, it took me several times to get through. It's like dealing with the Kremlin, getting to him, and the Stalin-era Kremlin. That's like, he's protected by layers and layers of people, as you might imagine.
Sure.
It's the same thing with Paul McCartney, and so I had to go through his attorney in L.A., and I tried several times. I got no reply, and I waited, several months in between. Finally, I got a response back from his lawyer saying, thank you very much, but he wants nothing to do with it. And then that very same day, Ringo himself put out a statement on his Facebook page and on his Twitter account saying, basically, this book has nothing to do with me. It's not authorized. Mentioned me by name and just signed off peace and love, which is pretty much what he generally says to everything.
Yeah.
So, but it did. It spurred more interest than I thought it would, and people said, "Oh, you're writing a book about Ringo? Well, here's my story." But I was lucky in getting a lot of people to talk to me, and I went to Liverpool and I tracked down a boyhood friend of Ringo's who'd never ever spoken before, a guy named Dave Patterson, whose family actually swapped houses with Ringo and his mother when they were about 3 or 4 years old. Ringo and his mother Elsie moved from Madryn Street to Admiral Grove in Liverpool, and Dave Patterson and his family moved from Admiral Grove to Madryn Street and did the same. They just basically swapped houses.
Right.
So people like that, and the people in Liverpool were very helpful, and when I went over there and I did some radio interviews, and that helped spread the word.
And speaking of Liverpool, I think a lot of fans have this notion that the group were all from these working class, lower income families, and they grew up in the slums of Liverpool, and that's actually not the case. Only Ringo did.
Right, and it's a good point. It's a fair point. John Lennon wrote about, working class hero, but Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison were all middle class Liverpool. Ringo grew up in a neighborhood known as the Dingle, still is. It's down by the docks, very rough and tumble area, as you said. An only child with a father who left the family when he was 3, so his mother worked several jobs. Elsie, that's Ringo's mother, to keep a roof over his head. I mean, it wasn't abject poverty, and he's also been described, or his early life has also been described as sort of a ragamuffin. It wasn't quite that bad, but they were not wealthy or even middle class by any stretch of the imagination. But I mean, there was certainly not a lot of money there, and I think when he hit it big with the Beatles, if you can see in the book, he basically went on he binged like his, buying everything in sight. But on the other hand, you can't blame him. I mean, he had no money growing up, and here's a guy who is 24 years old and is in the biggest rock band in the world, and known the world over, and all of a sudden has all this money coming in, and we would probably all deal with it the same way. I mean, these were kids. People forget all 4 Beatles were basically kids. They were young adults,
right? When
they became very famous, and they weren't even 30 yet when the band broke up. Ringo was about to turn 30, so it's a lot to take in, and it does a lot to your personality and to your psyche, I would imagine, being at the center of this huge storm that just sweeps across the world, and you're heralded as one of the 4 people who have impacted a generation, and you're acclaimed and derided in some corners. And I think Ringo, once the band broke up, had a tough time dealing with his post-Beatles life, despite some early success as a solo act. Eventually, he got caught up in alcoholism and money problems and recording issues, and he came full circle by sort of pulling himself up by his bootstraps with a lot of help from his second wife, Barbara Bach. Eventually, both of them went into rehab, got their life together, and he's very successful today, as we know, and still touring and sober. And there's a lot to be said for that. A lot to be said for somebody who is able to overcome all that adversity, even though they're wealthy. Money obviously can't buy you happiness. And,
sure.
Or emotional stability, for that matter.
Right. Or love.
Love. That's right. Can't buy me love. That's right. Exactly.
Can't buy me love.
We're talking to author Michael Seth Starr. The book is Ringo with a Little Help. I'd like to go back to those dark days in Ringo's life when he was struggling with alcoholism. And specifically, I'd like to talk about that unreleased album that he recorded, the Chips
Moment.
Yeah. Can you give us a sort of a thumbnail sketch of that whole situation?
Ringo had met Chips Moment. I believe they were on vacation in the Bahamas, and they talked about working together. And Ringo went to Nashville in the mid '80s, in the midst of drinking binges and hanging out with Harry Nilsson and just drinking himself to excess, and he went to Nashville to cut this album with Chip's Moment, and Chips was drinking too. It was not a good scene, and not a whole lot of work got done. They did end up eventually cutting an album that Ringo was not happy with, and Chip's Moment wanted to release the album. Ringo went to court to sue him. He won, as a matter of fact. Chip's Moment, I believe, had to pay Ringo's the legal bills. The album has never seen the light of day. And in talking to people who were there, or even who worked on the album, and I interviewed a videographer who was videotaping the whole thing. It was just not a good scene at that point. Ringo was not at his finest, to put it that way. He realized that once he got clean and sober, which is why he took Chip's Moment to court to stop him from releasing the album. Which, let's face it, even the hardest of hardcore Beatles fans, do you really want to hear that? I mean, probably not.
And the amazing thing is, he, as you say, sobered up and bounced right back, and he put out the Time Takes Time album, which is one of the finest solo albums in his entire catalog. Ringo Starr from his 1992 album Time Takes Time, and a song called I Don't Believe You. Our guest today is Michael Seth Starr. He's the author of a book called Ringo with a Little Help, and as we start to wrap up here, we'll bring the story up to date. Ringo's past few solo albums have included songs that are primarily love letters to his hometown, love letters to Liverpool. But recently, I guess within the last, 10 years or so, Ringo and Liverpool have had a tempestuous relationship, to say the least.
Yeah, he was on the Jonathan Ross show. It was back in 2008. It was a weird time. He said a lot of weird things around then, and that was around the time that he announced to his fans that he wouldn't sign anything. He went onto his website and posted a video which showed him acting very strangely.
Oh, you know what? Let's play that, because I have a feeling a lot of my listeners have probably never heard this.
This is a serious message to everybody.
We're sending objects, albums, clothes, photos to Ringo, and he was signing them, which speaks well of Ringo, but then they were showing up on eBay, and there were people out there who were basically starting careers as dealers in Ringo's autograph, which is why Ringo was so upset at the time. But let's go back. So the Jonathan Ross show.
Yeah, he was on a Jonathan Ross show in the UK, and Jonathan Ross asked Ringo what he missed most about Liverpool, and he said nothing. He was probably kidding around, but it was taken the wrong way. I know that there was a topiary of the Beatles in Liverpool by the tube station that they chopped off Ringo's head. It was chopped his head off the bush. It was only John, Paul, and George. And he went on, and he was supposed to be on the Live with Regis and Kelly at that time here in the U.S., and he stormed out because they wouldn't let him play his song. It was a very strange time, but I think you're right. He's gone to great lengths since then, I think, to patch things up with the people of Liverpool. And the person I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, Dave Patterson, his boyhood friend, he's also, Ringo gives him a shout-out in one of the songs from his later albums. And he seems to be embracing his past, I think, more now as he's turned 75. It's probably a time where, his place in rock history is cemented. Maybe he's a little more secure now. I think there was a time where he wasn't so secure of his place in rock history or his standing among rock and roll fans. But the older we all get, baby boomers and everybody, I think the more people appreciate Ringo and what he means to rock and what he meant to the Beatles and what he means to the world of drumming.
Well, the book we've been talking about today, Ringo with a Little Help, came out last summer. So is there anything else cooking?
My next book will be a biography of William Shatner.
Oh, wow.
It'll be out in a couple of years. I'm just getting started on that. My day job I'm here at the New York Post. I cover television, keeps me very busy. So I have to be very picky and choosy on what I do, because I just these books take a lot of time and research and all that. And I figured, listen, William Shatner, obviously Star Trek, and the guy, I think he just turned 85.
Yes.
A couple weeks back. He just keeps on going.
Well, Shatner to me is just amazing. I mean, this guy was an icon, and then he was down and out for a little while, and then he was back on television, and then he reinvented himself as the coolest guy on the planet. He's had the best second, third, and fourth acts in show business history.
it's almost it almost follows the Ringo's arc in a way. With the
It does.
hot in the '60s, nowhere in the '70s and '80s, and then boom, all of a sudden there he was on Boston Legal making Priceline commercials, Star Trek. He's still beloved for that, and he's huge on Twitter, and he's always arguing with people on social media. So
it's hysterical.
Keeping himself relevant, and I think he's still relevant, and hopefully we'll be able to convey that.
Thank you so much, Michael. Where can people go if they want to catch up with you? You got a web page or something like that?
Well, they can. I have a personal website, which is michaelsethstarr.com, and can always reach me at my nypost.com and my Twitter feed if they're interested. It's biowriter61.
All right. Thanks so much. You have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. You too. Appreciate it.
I was a sailor first.